The dinner that changed everything. The soft hum of jazz music filled the air, weaving through the clinking of silverware and hushed conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the elegantly dressed diners at La Magnifique, the city's most exclusive restaurant. It was a place where the wealthy and powerful gathered to celebrate success, seal business deals, and indulge in the finest cuisine money could buy. At a prime corner table, Nathaniel Reed, a self-made millionaire with sharp features and a commanding presence, sat across from his stunning girlfriend, Evelyn Carter. Her sapphire blue dress shimmered under the dim lighting, her delicate wrist adorned with a diamond bracelet that likely cost more than most people's yearly salaries. She laughed, her melodic voice effortlessly filling the space between them, her manicured fingers swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux. Nathaniel, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, nodded along as Evelyn spoke about their upcoming trip to Santorini. They were to spend 3 weeks in a private villa overlooking the Aegean Sea, a much-needed escape from the bustling corporate world he had built around himself. "You're going to love it," Evelyn purred, her hand lightly grazing his. "Sunsets that melt into the sea, candlelit dinners on the cliffs, and nothing but relaxation." Nathaniel forced a smile, lifting his wine glass to his lips. The truth was, he wasn't entirely present. He was used to luxury, to effortless charm, to nights filled with expensive wine and even more expensive company. But something about tonight felt off. An invisible weight pressed against his chest, a nagging feeling he couldn't shake. Then, across the restaurant, amidst the polished elegance of the elite, he saw her. A woman dressed in a simple black uniform, moving between tables with quiet efficiency. A woman who, despite her attempt to blend into the background, stood out to him like a beacon in the night. Claire Dawson, his ex-wife. The sight of her stopped his breath cold. For a moment, he thought he was mistaken, that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Claire wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be in another city, another life, far away from the world he had built for himself after their divorce. But it was her. He would know that face anywhere. The high cheekbones, the deep brown eyes that once held so much warmth, and the way she tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear when she was nervous. Nathaniel barely noticed Evelyn's voice continuing in the background. His attention was locked on Claire as she moved swiftly from table to table, balancing a tray of delicate china plates with practiced grace. She looked different. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, but also an exhaustion that had settled into her features. Then he saw the child. A small boy, no older than 3, sitting in a high chair tucked discreetly in the corner near the staff entrance. His tiny fingers curled around a plush toy, his dark tousled hair falling over a round face with soft but striking features. Nathaniel's heart stopped. The boy's deep brown eyes, his eyes, gazed up at Claire with innocent curiosity. The resemblance was unmistakable. His pulse pounded against his ribs. The world around him blurred, the background noise fading into nothingness. It was as if time had frozen. The boy. He looked exactly like him. 1,000 thoughts clashed in his mind, none of them making sense. He had no children, at least none that he knew of. He and Claire had been married for 5 years before their relationship crumbled under the weight of his relentless ambition. Their divorce had been final, their paths completely severed. Or so he had thought. "Darling," Evelyn's voice cut through his stupor. "You're barely listening. What's wrong?" Nathaniel's grip tightened around the stem of his wine glass, his knuckles turning white. His mouth felt dry, his mind a battlefield of questions and emotions he hadn't expected. But there was only one that truly mattered. Had Claire kept his child a secret from him? As if sensing the weight of his gaze, Claire's eyes finally lifted, meeting his across the room. In that single second, everything changed. A flicker of recognition, followed by panic, passed over her face. Her posture stiffened, her fingers clenching the edge of the tray she was holding. Then, just as quickly, she turned away, disappearing into the back of the restaurant. Nathaniel shot up from his seat. Nate. Evelyn's voice was laced with confusion. I need a moment, he muttered, already moving. His heart pounded as he strode through the restaurant, ignoring the curious glances from other diners. The controlled, calculated world he had built for himself was suddenly unraveling at the seams. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The confrontation. Nathaniel's footsteps echoed against the polished floors of La Magnifique as he followed the path Claire had taken. His pulse pounded in his ears, each beat fueling the growing storm of questions inside him. He pushed past the velvet curtain leading to the back corridors, his breath sharp and heavy. The scent of fresh bread and simmering sauces clung to the air, but he barely noticed. His mind was singularly focused on one thing, Claire, and the child that looked exactly like him. Rounding a corner, he found her in the narrow hallway near the employee lockers. She was facing away from him, leaning against a metal counter, gripping its edge with both hands. Her head was slightly bowed, as if gathering herself. Claire. She froze. Slowly, she turned around, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel. The way she said his name, calm, controlled, with the barest hint of apprehension, sent a shiver through him. You're working here. His voice came out sharper than he intended, a mix of shock and something dangerously close to guilt. Her lips pressed into a firm line. Why does that matter to you? Because He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. His mind was still stuck on what he had just seen. The boy. His son. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the resemblance was uncanny. Nathaniel stepped forward, lowering his voice. Who is he, Claire? Her body tensed, her fingers tightening on the counter behind her. Who? The child. His voice was quieter now, more controlled, but the intensity in his eyes burned. The boy sitting in the corner. The one with. He swallowed. The one with my eyes. Claire's throat moved as she swallowed hard. For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. You don't get to ask that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. She wasn't denying it. His world, so meticulously built on logic and certainty, was spiraling. If that boy was his, why had she kept him a secret? Why had she never told him? He stepped closer. Tell me the truth, Claire. She looked away. I have to get back to work. The hell you do, he snapped, his voice hushed but firm. I just found out that I might have a son, and you expect me to just walk away. Claire's hands curled into fists at her sides. She took a shaky breath, then turned to face him, her eyes flashing. You walked away a long time ago, Nathaniel, she said bitterly. You left first. The words cut deep. He felt them lodge somewhere inside him, twisting like a blade. His voice was quieter now. I didn't know. She scoffed. And if you did, would it have changed anything? Nathaniel stared at her. He didn't know how to answer that. Because he hadn't known. And now, standing here in this dimly lit hallway, the weight of that truth was suffocating. After a long silence, Claire sighed and shook her head. Go back to your table, Nathaniel. Go back to your perfect life, to your rich girlfriend and your vacations. Her voice softened slightly. Just let this be. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after what he had seen. He swallowed, his throat dry. What's his name? Claire hesitated for only a moment before she said it. Oliver. Nathaniel closed his eyes for the briefest second, the name settling in his chest like a weight. Oliver. A name he had never spoken, never known. A child who had existed in this world for 3 years without him. His son. His world, once so orderly, had just been shattered. The past rewritten. Nathaniel barely remembered walking back to the table where Evelyn waited. His mind was a whirlwind, his hands clenched at his sides. When he sat down, Evelyn tilted her head at him. Everything okay? He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, just work stuff. A lie, one of the biggest he had ever told. Because the truth was a storm he wasn't ready to face. For the rest of the dinner, Evelyn prattled on about their trip, about the exclusive gala she wanted to attend next week. Nathaniel nodded in the right places, pretended to care, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. It was on Oliver. On the way Claire had looked at him, not with anger, not even hatred, but pain. Pain that he had never seen before. The kind of pain that made him wonder just how much he had truly lost. That night, after he dropped Evelyn off at her penthouse, Nathaniel drove through the city aimlessly, his grip tight on the steering wheel. Then, without fully realizing it, he found himself parked in front of an old, modest apartment complex. Claire's building. The lights were on in a second-floor window. She was home. And so was Oliver. His heart pounded as he sat there, staring up at the window. Should he go up? Demand answers. But what right did he even have? After all, he was the one who had left. The past had come full circle, and now he had to decide what to do with it. A father's choice. Nathaniel sat in his sleek black Aston Martin, parked across the street from Claire's apartment complex. The dashboard glowed faintly in the darkness, casting eerie blue shadows across his tense face. His hands gripped the steering wheel as if letting go would send him spiraling into the storm of emotions raging inside him. 3 years. That's how long he had been a father without knowing it. A part of him still struggled to grasp the reality. Claire had kept his son from him. She had made the choice, whether out of anger, fear, or something else entirely, to erase him from Oliver's life. And yet, hadn't he done the same to her? Nathaniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. He had left Claire. He had walked away from their marriage, convinced that love and commitment were secondary to success. He had been young, ambitious, desperate to carve his name into the business world. And in the process, he had sacrificed the one thing that had ever truly mattered. And now he had a son, a child he had never met, a boy who didn't even know his name. His fingers hovered over his phone, his thumb resting on Claire's contact. Should he call? Text? Or would she just ignore him, shutting the door on him the way he had once shut it on her? A light flickered in the second-floor apartment. A small shadow moved across the window. A tiny figure, barely reaching the sill. Oliver. Nathaniel's heart clenched. He had been so focused on the shock of discovering his existence that he hadn't stopped to consider the most important thing. What kind of man would he be if he walked away now? No, he wasn't going to let that happen. Nathaniel pushed open the car door and stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. His legs carried him forward before his mind could stop him, up the steps, through the entrance, and down the dimly lit hallway, until he stood outside apartment 2B. His hand hesitated over the door. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he knocked. The moment of truth. The door opened faster than he expected. Claire stood there, dressed in a loose sweater and leggings, her hair pulled into a messy bun. Her expression immediately shifted from tired confusion to alarm. "Nathaniel," she whispered, glancing behind her as if afraid someone might hear. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I had to see you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Claire crossed her arms, blocking the doorway like a human shield. "You need to leave." "No." He shook his head. "Not until we talk." She let out a sharp breath, clearly debating whether to slam the door in his face. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she stepped aside just enough for him to enter. Nathaniel took a cautious step inside. The apartment was small but warm, the scent of lavender and baby powder filling the air. Toys were neatly stacked in one corner, and a small bookshelf sat against the wall, filled with colorful picture books. His gaze fell on the couch, where a small bundle of blankets stirred. "Oliver." Nathaniel barely breathed as he stepped closer. The little boy was curled up, his tiny fists resting near his face, dark lashes fanned over his round cheeks. A soft plush bear was tucked under his arm. He was so small, so fragile. And yet, in that moment, Nathaniel felt something inside him crack open. A fierce, unshakable need to protect him, to know him, to be his father. Claire's voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Nathaniel turned to face her, emotions raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire's jaw tightened. "Because you didn't want this life, Nathaniel. You made that clear when you walked away." He ran a hand through his hair. "That's not fair. I didn't know." "Exactly," she snapped. "You didn't know because I didn't tell you. And you know why? Because you were too busy chasing money and power to care about a family." Her words struck deep. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "That's not true." Claire folded her arms, her voice quieter now. "Tired, isn't it?" Nathaniel exhaled. He had no argument. Not really. For years, he had convinced himself that their love had been a casualty of their differences, that he had left because they had simply grown apart. But standing here, in Claire's small apartment, looking at the child that carried his blood, his features, he realized just how much of a fool he had been. His gaze softened. "Claire, I know I can't change the past, but I want to be in his life. I have to." Claire's arms tightened around herself. "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," he pleaded. "Tell me what I need to do." For the first time, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She shook her head. "I don't know if I can trust you, Nathaniel. I don't know if you're just here out of guilt, or if you'll get bored and disappear again." His chest ached at the thought. He took a slow step toward her. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I swear to you, I'm not leaving again." Claire let out a shaky breath. "He doesn't know you. You can't just walk in and expect to be his father overnight." "I don't expect that." Nathaniel's voice was steady. "But I want to try." She hesitated, glancing toward Oliver's sleeping form. For the first time, Nathaniel saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of letting him in, of letting him hurt them again. After a long silence, Claire spoke. "One step at a time," she murmured. "That's all I can give you." It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. "One step at a time," he echoed. For the first time in years, hope flickered inside him. He wasn't going to let this slip away. This time, he would fight for his family. Nathaniel stood in Claire's living room, the weight of her words still sinking in. One step at a time. It wasn't the answer he wanted. He wanted full access, the chance to be Oliver's father immediately. He wanted to make up for the years lost, for the moments he had unknowingly missed. Oliver's first steps, his first words, his first everything. But Claire wasn't wrong. He couldn't just walk in and expect to claim that role overnight. He had spent years putting business before everything else. He had thought money and power were the only things that mattered. But now, staring at the small boy asleep on the couch, he realized he had been chasing the wrong things all along. Claire sighed and rubbed her temples, her exhaustion clear. "You should go," she murmured. "It's late." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to leave, but he also knew pushing too hard now might ruin his only chance. "All right." His voice was quiet. "But I'm coming back." Claire hesitated, then nodded slowly. One step at a time. Nathaniel turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. His gaze drifted back to Oliver, who let out a soft sigh in his sleep, snuggling deeper into his plush bear. The sight of him, so small, so innocent, so unaware of the war raging between his parents, hit Nathaniel harder than anything ever had. He didn't just want to be in Oliver's life. He needed to be. Turning back to Claire, he met her tired but guarded eyes. "Good night, Claire." She hesitated, then whispered, "Good night." With that, he stepped out into the cold night air, his mind already planning his next move. A change of priorities. Nathaniel barely slept. By morning, he was back in his penthouse, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Normally, he thrived on mornings like this. early wake-ups, black coffee, and a relentless drive toward success. But today, his priorities had shifted. He dialed his assistant, Ethan, who answered immediately. "Sir, I need my schedule cleared," Nathaniel said. Ethan hesitated. "Cleared? As in, nothing takes priority over what I'm about to do." A longer pause. "Understood. Anything specific I should be aware of?" Nathaniel hesitated. He didn't want to explain. Not yet. But he needed Ethan to understand this wasn't a temporary distraction. "I have something important in my life now, Ethan. Make sure nothing interrupts it." "Yes, sir." Nathaniel hung up and exhaled. He had spent years living for business. Now, for the first time in his life, he was living for something else. For someone else. For Oliver. The first meeting. By the afternoon, Nathaniel was back at Claire's apartment, knocking on the door. It took a minute before she opened it, looking at him with cautious eyes. "You're early," she muttered. "I told you I was coming back," he said simply. Claire sighed but stepped aside to let him in. "Oliver's still napping." Nathaniel nodded, walking inside. This time, he noticed more, the small details that made this space a home. A framed picture of Claire holding Oliver as a baby, a handmade crayon drawing stuck to the fridge, a bookshelf overflowing with children's books. It was nothing like the penthouse he lived in. But somehow, it felt warmer. Claire sat on the couch, watching him carefully. "So, what's your plan, Nathaniel?" He met her gaze. "To be here, to get to know my son." She swallowed, looking away. "You don't have to do this out of guilt." "It's not guilt." His voice was firm. "It's responsibility. It's—" He hesitated, exhaling. "It's what I want." Claire studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of deception. Then, a small voice interrupted them. "Mommy." Nathaniel's breath caught. Slowly, he turned to see Oliver standing in the hallway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Claire's posture stiffened, but she didn't stop what came next. Oliver blinked at Nathaniel, his tiny face crunching in confusion. "Who's that?" Nathaniel's throat felt tight. He should have been here for this moment years ago. Claire hesitated before kneeling beside Oliver, her voice soft. This is Nathaniel." Oliver blinked again. "Nathaniel." He looked up at him, then back at his mother. "He looks like me." Nathaniel's breath hitched. Claire swallowed. "Yeah, sweetheart. He does." Oliver tilted his head, clearly trying to make sense of it. Then, to Nathaniel's shock, the little boy walked toward him. Tiny footsteps, a small, fragile child. Nathaniel knelt down so he wasn't towering over him. "Hi, Oliver." His voice was soft, careful. Oliver studied him, then, much to Nathaniel's surprise, reached out and touched his face. His small fingers traced his jaw, then his cheek, as if trying to figure out why they looked the same. Then, Oliver giggled. "You have my eyes." Nathaniel let out a shaky breath, his heart swelling with something he had never felt before. "Love. Pure, undeniable love." "Yes, I do," he whispered. Claire watched them, her arms folded, her face unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something softer, something almost like hope. Oliver grinned up at Nathaniel, completely unaware of the history between the adults in the room. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Nathaniel smiled. "I think I do now." Oliver grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the small toy bin in the corner. "Come on. I'll show you my favorite one." And just like that, everything changed. Nathaniel had made a lot of deals in his life. He had shaken hands on billion-dollar contracts, negotiated power plays that made headlines. But this was the most important deal of his life, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Claire watched them, her emotions hidden behind her guarded expression. One step at a time. That was what she had said. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel was willing to take things slow. Because this time, he was playing for keeps. Proving himself. Nathaniel sat on the floor of Claire's small apartment, his 6'2" frame looking awkwardly out of place among a sea of brightly colored plastic dinosaurs. Across from him, Oliver sat cross-legged, clutching a green T-Rex in one small hand, while his other hand absent-mindedly played with the edge of his sock. Nathaniel had faced billion-dollar negotiations. He had walked into boardrooms filled with sharks, into power plays where a single wrong move could cost him everything. But none of that had prepared him for this, for sitting in front of his son, trying to act like a normal person when his heart felt like it was going to beat out of his chest. Oliver inspected him with a seriousness that was both endearing and terrifying. The way children could read people, so purely, so honestly, was something money could never teach. "Do you know how to make a dinosaur sound?" Oliver finally asked, his dark brown eyes locking onto Nathaniel's with expectation. Nathaniel blinked. A dinosaur sound. Oliver nodded solemnly. Claire, who had been standing in the kitchen watching them from a distance, snorted. She quickly covered it up with a cough, but Nathaniel shot her a sharp look. The woman had never laughed at anything he said before. Oliver tilted his head, waiting. Nathaniel hesitated, then sighed. "All right. What kind of dinosaur?" Oliver's eyes lit up. T-Rex. Nathaniel let out another deep breath and, with as much dignity as he could manage, let out a low, growling roar. Silence. Then Oliver burst into giggles. Nathaniel blinked. Was that bad? Oliver shook his head, still laughing. No, it was funny. Claire, arms folded against her chest, gave Nathaniel a look that was somewhere between amused and shocked. "You used to be so serious," she murmured under her breath. Nathaniel met her gaze. "I still am. But some things are worth making a fool of myself for." Her smile faded. Her grip on her arms tightened. She wasn't ready to hear that yet. Nathaniel turned back to Oliver, his throat tight. "All right, kid. You've got to show me how it's done. What's the best dinosaur roar?" Oliver grinned. He sucked in a deep breath, then let out the loudest, most dramatic dinosaur scream Nathaniel had ever heard. Nathaniel laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years. And in that moment, he knew this was it. This was what had been missing in his life all along. Building bridges. Over the next few days, Nathaniel came back. Every evening after work, he would show up at Claire's apartment, knocking on the door like a man who refused to be left out of his son's life. At first, Claire was hesitant. She kept her distance, watching him with the same guarded expression. But Nathaniel noticed the way she softened every time Oliver reached for him. He noticed how she didn't protest when Oliver pulled him into bedtime stories. How she didn't stop him when Oliver asked if Nathaniel could sit with him during dinner. How by the end of the week, she had finally stopped checking the clock every 5 minutes, as if expecting him to leave. Because he didn't leave. And Oliver? Oliver loved every second of it. One night, as Nathaniel helped Oliver build a Lego tower, Claire leaned against the kitchen counter, watching them. Nathaniel glanced at her. "You don't have to stand there looking like I might break something." Claire arched a brow. "I'm not worried about you breaking anything." "Then what?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, she admitted, "I'm waiting to see if you're going to disappear." Nathaniel's hand stilled on the Lego blocks. Oliver, oblivious, continued stacking pieces. He took a slow breath, turning to fully face her. "I'm not leaving, Claire." She held his gaze. "You always left before." Nathaniel swallowed. "I know." A heavy silence settled between them. Then Oliver suddenly yawned, rubbing at his eyes. Claire sighed. "Bedtime." Oliver immediately protested, latching onto Nathaniel's arm. "No, stay." Nathaniel chuckled. "I'll be back tomorrow, buddy." Oliver pouted. Nathaniel ruffled his hair, then turned back to Claire. "Can I put him to bed?" Her eyes widened slightly, like the thought had never occurred to her. She hesitated for so long that Nathaniel thought she was going to say no. Then softly, she said, Okay. Nathaniel gently scooped Oliver up, carrying him to his tiny bed, tucking him under the blankets. The little boy blinked sleepily at him. "Good night," Nathaniel whispered. Oliver reached up, small fingers brushing against Nathaniel's cheek. "Good night, Daddy." Nathaniel's breath caught. "Daddy." It had slipped out naturally, effortlessly, as if it had always been meant to be. Nathaniel's throat tightened, emotion choking him, but he managed to whisper, "Good night, Oliver." When he stepped back into the living room, Claire was staring at him. Something raw, something unguarded flashed across her face for the first time in years. "Nathaniel," she murmured, "what are you really doing here?" He exhaled. "I'm trying," he admitted, "trying to be something more than the man who left, trying to be the father he deserves." Claire's gaze dropped. "And me." He took a step closer. "I don't know, but I know I don't want to lose either of you again." Claire let out a shaky breath. "It's not that simple." "I know," he murmured. "But I meant it, Claire. I'm not leaving this time." Silence stretched between them. Then, Claire did something that made Nathaniel's chest ache. She let her guard down, just for a second. She didn't push him away. She didn't argue. Instead, she just nodded. And in that moment, Nathaniel knew this wasn't just about proving himself to Oliver. This was about proving himself to Claire, too. The walls between us. Nathaniel lay awake in his penthouse that night, staring at the ceiling. The city skyline outside his window stretched into the darkness, glittering with lights. He had built this life, one of power, prestige, and untouchable success. Yet for the first time in years, he felt like he had nothing. Oliver had called him Daddy. The word had settled deep in his chest, a warm ache he didn't know how to process. He had spent so much of his life chasing wealth, believing that money would fix everything. But now, after everything, he was realizing that the most valuable thing he had ever lost was a family he never even knew he had. And then there was Claire. She was different now. Stronger, more guarded. She had built an entire life without him, and he wasn't sure if she had room for him in it. He had promised her that he wasn't leaving. But the real question was, would she ever let him in? Fighting for a place. The next morning, Nathaniel showed up at Claire's apartment earlier than usual. She opened the door in sweatpants and an oversized sweater, blinking at him in surprise. "You're here early," she said, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "I figured I should get used to mornings with Oliver." Claire hesitated but then stepped aside, letting him in. Oliver was sitting at the small dining table, swinging his legs under the chair as he ate a bowl of cereal. His eyes lit up when he saw Nathaniel. "Daddy." Nathaniel's heart stumbled. It still felt surreal. Claire's spoon clattered against her coffee mug. She inhaled sharply, like she was still processing how naturally Oliver said it. Nathaniel forced himself to stay steady, to act like he had every right to that title, even though he hadn't earned it yet. "Hey, buddy." He sat down across from Oliver, nodding toward his cereal. "What's for breakfast?" "Frosted Flakes," Oliver declared proudly, stuffing a spoonful into his mouth. "You want some?" Nathaniel glanced at Claire, who was watching him carefully. He could see the battle in her eyes, letting him in versus keeping her guard up. But before she could say anything, Oliver was already climbing down from his chair, dragging a step stool toward the cabinet. Nathaniel instinctively reached out, steadying it before Oliver could wobble. The little boy looked up at him, his dark eyes so much like Nathaniel's. "Mommy says I can do it myself," Oliver said seriously. "'Cause I'm a big boy." Nathaniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. He had missed so much. So many little moments. He wasn't going to miss any more. "All right, big boy," Nathaniel said, stepping back. "Show me how it's done." Oliver beamed, successfully pulling out a bowl, then struggling with the cereal box. Nathaniel watched as Claire quietly came up behind him, guiding his tiny hands so he didn't spill half the box onto the floor. It was a simple moment, but it was everything. And Nathaniel realized, this is what I've been missing. This is what I should have been here for. Unfinished business. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel helped Claire clean up the kitchen while Oliver played in the living room. Claire was unusually quiet. She washed the dishes in slow, methodical movements, her brow slightly furrowed. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "You're waiting for me to leave, aren't you?" Claire's hands paused under the running water. She closed her eyes for a second and sighed. "I don't know what I'm waiting for." Nathaniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You don't believe I'll stay." She turned off the water and grabbed a dish towel. "History hasn't exactly been in your favor, Nathaniel." He exhaled slowly. "I deserve that." Claire dried her hands, then turned to face him. "I need to ask you something." He nodded. "Go ahead." Her lips pressed together, her voice quieter now. "Why did you leave me?" Nathaniel froze. Of all the things she could have asked, he hadn't expected that. Claire rarely talked about the past. She had always locked it away, burying it beneath layers of strength and independence. But now, she was looking at him like she needed to understand. Nathaniel inhaled deeply, rubbing his jaw. "Because I was stupid." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's not an answer." Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides. He hated who he had been back then. "I was afraid," he admitted, his voice rough. "Afraid that I wasn't enough. Afraid that if I stayed, I'd drag you down with me." Claire's brows pulled together. "That doesn't make sense." Nathaniel let out a hollow laugh. "It didn't make sense to me either. But back then, I thought success was the only thing that mattered. I told myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I just earned enough, then I could come back and fix everything." He swallowed hard. "But by the time I realized what I had lost, you were already gone." Silence stretched between them. Claire's fingers tightened around the dish towel. "And if you had known about Oliver?" Nathaniel's chest ached. "I never would have left," he said, his voice thick with regret. Claire let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. Nathaniel took a slow step forward. "Let me prove it." She didn't move away, didn't push him back. She just stood there, her walls threatening to crack. Finally, she looked up at him, something raw in her expression. "I don't know how to let you back in, Nathaniel." His throat tightened. "Then don't. Let me find my way back in myself." A single tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, like she was angry at herself for being vulnerable. But Nathaniel saw it. And for the first time, he saw the truth. Claire had never stopped caring. She had just learned to survive without him. And now, it was up to him to show her that she didn't have to anymore. One step at a time. That night, Nathaniel sat with Oliver on the couch, reading him a bedtime story while Claire watched from the kitchen. Oliver snuggled into his side, yawning. "Will you be here tomorrow?" he mumbled sleepily. Nathaniel's throat tightened. He pressed a gentle kiss to Oliver's forehead. "Always." Claire's eyes softened from across the room. For the first time, Nathaniel knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And he wasn't going anywhere. The breaking point. Nathaniel had always been a man of control. Every part of his life. His business, his investments, his reputation had been built on discipline, on carefully measured decisions. But this was chaos. The chaos of bedtime stories and dinosaur roars. The chaos of Oliver's laughter echoing in his ears. The chaos of Claire's guarded glances, the way her lips pressed together every time she hesitated before trusting him. And the chaos of knowing that for the first time in his life, he didn't want control. He wanted this, all of it. But wanting something didn't mean you got it. And tonight, he was about to find out just how fragile this second chance really was. A moment of doubt. Nathaniel arrived at Claire's apartment later than usual. Work had dragged him back in. No matter how much he tried to clear his schedule, the empire he had built refused to loosen its grip. By the time he knocked on Claire's door, it was past 8. She opened it, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're late," she said. Nathaniel exhaled. "I know. Oliver came running. "Daddy." The sound of it still sent a shockwave through him. He crouched down, opening his arms as Oliver crashed into him, hugging him tight. Nathaniel held him, closing his eyes for a moment. God, he had missed so much. But he was here now. "I thought you weren't coming," Oliver mumbled into his shirt. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "I'll always come back, buddy." Oliver nodded sleepily, already satisfied with that answer. But Claire, she wasn't so easily convinced. Nathaniel felt her watching him, judging him. And as he set Oliver down and stood up, he saw it in her eyes. Doubt. The same doubt that had been there from the beginning. Nathaniel's chest tightened. Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "He was waiting for you, Nathaniel." Guilt settled deep in his bones. "I know," he admitted, voice quiet. "I got caught up in work." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Work, right. That's always the excuse, isn't it?" Nathaniel's jaw tensed. "Claire, I told you this wouldn't be easy," she cut in, her voice low but sharp. "I told you that if you were going to be in his life, you had to be all in." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair. "I am all in." Claire stared at him. "Then why do I feel like I'm still waiting for you to walk away?" Silence. Nathaniel felt the weight of those words. Because this was what she was afraid of all along, wasn't it? That he would come in, play the part, but eventually leave. And she wasn't wrong to be afraid. Because if he was honest with himself, he wasn't sure he knew how to balance this new life. He had spent years choosing business over everything else. Could he really change now? Could he be the father Oliver deserved? Could he be the man Claire needed him to be? He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to convince her. But before he could, Claire shook her head. "I can't do this," she whispered. Nathaniel froze. Her voice was shaky, but firm. "Nathaniel, I've spent years trying to move forward. I've raised him alone. I've built a life that works. And now, you're here, and I don't know if I can trust you not to rip it all apart again." Nathaniel stepped closer. "Claire, I swear to you, I am not leaving." Her breath hitched. "Then prove it." He stared at her, his pulse roaring in his ears. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. And Nathaniel wasn't going to lose. The grand gesture. Nathaniel spent the next week proving himself. He showed up every single day, on time, no matter what. He adjusted his work schedule, delegated responsibilities, pushed back meetings. For the first time in his life, he put his family before his business. And slowly, Claire started to see it. One night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Claire stood in the doorway, watching Nathaniel tuck him in. When he turned, their eyes met. She sighed. "You're really doing this?" Nathaniel nodded. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." Claire exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "This is the part where I'm supposed to believe you, right?" Nathaniel took a slow step toward her. "I don't need you to believe me right now." His voice was steady. "I just need you to keep letting me prove it." Claire searched his face. And for the first time, she didn't argue. The breaking point. But life had a way of testing people. Nathaniel had just started to feel like he was finally earning his place when his past came crashing back in. It happened on a Friday evening. Claire had let Nathaniel pick Oliver up from daycare, a huge step, a sign that she was starting to trust him. And for the first time in his entire life, he felt like a real father. Then his phone rang. Ethan. His assistant never called unless it was important. Nathaniel sighed, shifting Oliver onto his hip as he answered. "What is it?" Ethan's voice was urgent. "Sir, the board is requesting an emergency meeting. A deal is on the verge of collapsing." Nathaniel's jaw locked. Of course, just as he was finally getting things right, his old life came knocking. "You need to be here," Ethan pressed. Now. Nathaniel hesitated. Now. Right now. His eyes flicked to Oliver, who was happily playing with his toy dinosaur, completely unaware of the war raging inside his father. Nathaniel felt his grip on the phone tighten. This was the moment. The ultimate test. Work or family. The old Nathaniel would have gone. He would have handed Oliver back to Claire, made some excuse, and left. But the old Nathaniel had lost everything. And the new Nathaniel wasn't going to make the same mistake. No, he said firmly. Ethan paused. Sir. Nathaniel took a deep breath. I said no. On with my son. He could almost hear Ethan's shock. But. No buts, Nathaniel cut in. Figure it out. I'm not available. Then, before Ethan could argue, Nathaniel hung up. Claire, who had been watching the entire thing from the doorway, let out a slow breath. Nathaniel met her gaze, and for the first time, she looked at him like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Oliver tugged on his sleeve. Daddy? Nathaniel knelt beside him. Yeah, putty. Oliver grinned. Can we have ice cream? Nathaniel laughed. Yeah, he said softly, pulling Oliver into a hug. Let's go get ice cream. And for the first time, he chose his family. And he knew he'd never choose anything else again. The love rekindled. Nathaniel sat at Claire's kitchen table, watching Oliver swing his legs happily while eating his ice cream. It was such a simple thing. But this moment, this closeness, this ordinary happiness, was something Nathaniel had never known he wanted. Something he never wanted to lose again. Claire leaned against the counter, watching them with quiet contemplation. She hadn't said much since the phone call, since she had watched him choose them over work. And maybe she wasn't ready to say anything yet, but Nathaniel could feel the change in the air. This wasn't just about Oliver anymore. This was about them. About Claire and Nathaniel, and whether or not they still had something left to save. The heart always remembers. That night, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Nathaniel stayed behind. Claire hadn't asked him to leave, which, in itself, was progress. She sat on the couch, curled up with a blanket, staring at him like she was still trying to figure him out. Nathaniel met her gaze. You're quiet tonight. Claire exhaled. I'm thinking. About. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the fabric of the blanket. About you. About. Us. His chest tightened. I never stopped loving you, Claire, he admitted, even when I was too stubborn to see what I was losing, even when I told myself work mattered more. Claire closed her eyes for a second, then looked at him. You can't just say that now and expect everything to change, Nathaniel. I know. His voice was steady. That's why I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm not asking you to believe me just because I said the words. She swallowed. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'll keep proving it, Claire. Not just to Oliver, but to you. A soft breath escaped her lips. The wall she had spent years building between them was still there, but there were cracks in it now. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to let him in. Claire shook her head, letting out a soft laugh. You're impossible. Nathaniel smiled, tilting his head. Is that a bad thing? She didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, so slowly, she whispered, not always. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. For the first time in years, the future felt possible again. A new beginning. The next morning, Nathaniel woke up to the sound of small feet padding across the floor. Oliver climbed onto the couch where Nathaniel had fallen asleep, tugging at his sleeve. Nathaniel groggily blinked awake. Oliver grinned. Are you staying forever? Nathaniel's breath caught. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and pulled Oliver into his arms. Yes, he murmured against his son's hair. Forever. Claire stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Because for the first time, she believed it. And that was all that mattered.